thank you, happy few for coming. This is maybe a bit different than some of the other presentations, as it's about a straight up Old English medieval poem. But I hope that gives us a little bit of diversity, and it's not totally different from some of the other speculative fiction topics, as this poem has cannibals in it. So I think there's some affinities there. So let's jump into it. So what is Andreas, and what am I going to be talking about? So to give you a quick synopsis of the poem Andreas and what's in it, and what I'm going to be looking at, a few words. The poem Andreas, it comes from the Vercelli book, which is one of 4 manuscripts that we have that encapsulates almost all of the Old English poetry that still exists. Within this book, there are 6 poems and a series of homilies, and this is one of those 6 poems. A few other ones that you may have heard from this same manuscript are Elena and Fates of the Apostles. These are poems written by a poet whom we actually know his name, Cynewulf, and I'll talk more about these in a few minutes. So the poem tells the story of the disciple Andrew and his mission to rescue the disciple Matthew from some cannibals who've decided they're going to eat him. We do have a Latin prose version of this story called the Acta Andreae et Matthei. I believe actually this Latin prose rendition predates Andreas, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean. And then the poem itself, so to give you a quick plot synopsis of the poem, since I'm not going to be talking too much about it in terms of its narrative content. The general idea is Matthew decides it's a great idea to go and proselytize to this group of known cannibals, the Myrmidons. As you might expect, they decide it's a better idea to eat him, and so they imprison him and they decide they're going to eat him. God comes to Andrew and says, Andrew, please, I need you to go and rescue Matthew. So he goes, he finds a boat with a boatman, takes a sailing voyage over with his retinue of folks. They rescue Matthew from prison, and as a consequence, Andrew is captured, and they decide they're going to eat him instead. He manages to escape with God's help and purge the town of the evildoers and bring them to Christ. So in a nutshell, that's what the poem's about. It's a lot more fun than it sounds in that short synopsis, but there it is. So now with this poem, what I'm going to focus on is the questions of how this poem might have been composed and who might have composed it. Now, as I mentioned, we do know of at least one Old English poet whose name we know, that being Cynewulf. We know of him because he signed his name in 4 poems using runes. So at least we know this one person's name, this one poet's name, and we have at least 4 poems that we know that this poet wrote. So one scholarly debate about Andreas is whether or not Andreas may or may not have been written by Cynewulf, or did it not? Was it written earlier than Cynewulf or later, or so on? And there's a few reasons why people think that. So in the case of the Old English poetry timeline, as it were, I've just kind of laid out some of the poems and their relative dating here. For the most part, people they want to ascribe authorship by various criteria, and unfortunately, we don't know very much about the folks who wrote these poems. Even in the case of Cynewulf, we know his name, we don't know very much else. For the most part, what we know is intimately tied up, as Andy Orchard puts it, is intimately tied up with the issue of style. So scholars will look at these poems and compare them and contrast the style from various criteria and ascribe these 2 poems sound really similar, so maybe they're written by the same person. And people have made these kinds of arguments with Andreas and Cynewulf in particular. They seem to share a lot of style. Maybe they're written by the same person. As you might guess, other scholars make the opposite claim. Well, there are parts of Cynewulf that sound very Beowulfian, so maybe it's not Cynewulf, it's somebody else, and so on. So there's not a lot of consensus about who exactly wrote Andreas and whether or not it was before or after Cynewulf or contemporary with him. So One serious dilemma, though, when you're looking at these questions and you don't have much to go on other than the style of the poem, is what if the style is not uniform in the poem? And we have a lot of such examples where we know that that's the case already in the Old English poetic corpus. Poems such as the poem Genesis was one of the first to have been discovered to have a piece of it that was translated actually from Old Saxon. Guthlac is now split up into Guthlac A and B on stylistic grounds. The poem Daniel, The Dream of the Root, as well recently had an argument saying that it was actually a composite work of more than one author. So we know that this has occurred in the Old English poetic corpus. So before we can really make any judgments about the authorship or composition of a work, when that argument is going to be based on style, we first need to demonstrate that the style of that poem is uniform, and that demonstration has not really taken place with Andreas. So I set out to do it. So how did I go about doing this? As Franny said, I'm a computer programmer by trade, so I wanted to have some sort of quantitative approach to this, to really try to be as objective as I could about analyzing the style, if I'm going to have to make a stylistic argument. And so I did a few things. Number one, I took a couple of techniques developed by Dr. Drout, who was my advisor on this thesis, which you may have been familiar with through prior Signum talks, the so-called lexomics techniques of dendrogram analysis and rolling window analysis. I'll talk a little bit more about how I use those in a moment, but on top of that, I layered and I unfortunately have a cool name for it, but I layered an additional methodology that looks at oral-formulaic diction. So that same gentleman, Andy Orchard, who I quoted a minute ago, developed a lot of data looking at Andreas and the Cynewulfian signed poems and Beowulf, and looking at distinctive oral-formulaic language. So we know in oral-formulaic cultures and poetries that they have a lot of tropes and regular things that they would use when they compose that helped the culture to compose in that medium. And Andy Orchard showed that although that's a general thing in that culture that took place, you could also identify certain kinds of formulas that were kind of authorial tics, as it were. So distinctive formula that a particular poet tended to use. And so he compiled lists of this information. And so I took that as a starting point for adding an additional layer to lexomics that looks at phraseology at the broadest resolution, if you will, and then added the additional, the existing lexomic techniques to kind of zoom in and look at, with dendrogramming, individual words and word frequency and how that affects the style. And then the rolling window, which is, uses the individual symbols as a quantitative basis. And so the idea being, if all three of these techniques are seeing a composite work, then the feature is probably not a coincidence. That is a legitimate feature of the text that we're seeing. So for the first prong of attack, the shared formulaic diction, I took Andy Orchard's data and I did something that he didn't do. I'm not quite sure why, but he didn't plot it by line number. So he did look at it and make the argument that yes, Andreas shares a lot of formulaic diction with the signed poems of Cynewulf. Okay, and he had that component of the argument, but he didn't look at whether or not it was uniformly distributed throughout the poem. And when I plotted it versus line number, as you see on this top graph, you can see that it is not distributed uniformly throughout the poem. And what you actually see are these gaps in that distinctive Cynewulfian formulaic language that I've marked here as 1, 2, 3, 4, which is unusual. Maybe it's something, maybe it's nothing. When you compare it to a poem that we know is a signed poem of Cynewulf, though, it does look anomalous. The second graph here is the same analysis but done with Elena, a signed poem. And you can see that the distribution of the formulaic language is fairly uniform throughout the poem. So that initial analysis sets the basis for a divide that I'm calling Andreas A and Andreas B, with Andreas A being the sections that show a high amount of Cynewulfian formulaic language, and B being the sections that do not. the interesting thing about this is when you start looking at other ways to quantify that formulaic diction, and Andy Orchard did this for 4 categories. He did Cynewulfian formulaic language, Cynewulfian word compounds, so just single words, but that were compounded in a novel way for this author. And then the same thing with Beowulfian parallels, formulaic language, and Beowulfian compounds. The last one is the Andrean compounds. These are compounds that just happen to be unique to this poem that appear nowhere else. And when you plot this information relative to line number, as I did with the Cynewulfian formula, the anomaly persists. Okay. There's a lot to take in on this slide, but the takeaway message is for each of these metrics, I've calculated what I call an occurrence per line score for that chunk. So the number of occurrences of the feature that we're looking at for this chunk. And what you find are the B sections tend to have a high concentration of Beowulfian features and a low concentration of Cynewulfian features, and the vice versa for the A sections. So this feature persists. It's not just with the formulaic language, but also with the way that the poet is using word compounds. The other interesting thing is that when you do a close reading of this poem with this A-B distinction in mind, what you find is that the B sections, the sections that don't have any Cynewulfian formulaic language, tells the entire plot that I just outlined to you. That Andreas is called by God. He takes a voyage. He goes and rescues Matthew, and and defeats evil. All of this is contained in only 570 lines of the poem, less than half of the lines of the poem. You can read just the B sections and have virtually the entire story of Andrew's mission told to you, which is surprising. By contrast, if you look at the A sections and do a very close reading of those, what do we see? Well, we see discursive, what I'm calling homiletic sidebars. So these are extended passages where the narrative, not much goes on to move the plot forward, but the characters in the poem are expounding on some sort of Christian moral virtue or something of this effect. It really seems as if the A sections are expanding an existing poem in order to make more explicit a Christian message. But maybe that's just an effect of the formulaic language, right? So let's look at some of our other techniques. Let's jump to the rolling window analysis. And if I don't do any of these techniques justice, hit me up in the questions and I'll try to make a better explanation of what's going on here. What I'm doing with this technique, this is one that was developed by Dr. Drout at Wheaton College, is looking at the ratio of thorn symbols to eth symbols. And in Old English, these two symbols effectively are interchangeable. But they both essentially have the same use as the th in modern English. And so different scribes and different sources tend to use these letters slightly differently. And you can pick up on the differences, particularly when, and Dr. Drout demonstrated this in his papers on this technique when applied to some of those early poems I mentioned that had known composite authorship, that you can pinpoint areas where the source changes because the ratio changes for whatever reason. The scribe copying it changes source, and now he tends to copy with the same ratio as the thing that he's looking at as he's writing. So these sorts of orthographic tendencies can show up in composite works. And when we plot this ratio, where we're just calculating the number of thorns, the number of eths in a particular section of the poem, and we go through the poem doing that, and you can plot this ratio over line number, we see that those B sections that the oral-formulaic language suggested existed and were a different source are confirmed by the rolling window analysis. You see that at during each B section, the ratio tends to go downward. That's indicating that a lower number of thorns exist in that passage and a higher number of eths. Conversely, when those sections end, the ratio tends to reverse. You see, it's very striking at the end of B1, you have a sharp reduction up. At the bottom of B2, the ratio is really bottomed out. And what's interesting is when you look at this poem, or when you look at this metric with the entire manuscript, that is an incredibly low nadir of this ratio when you look at the entire manuscript. But even here, it's a striking feature that at the bottom of at the B2, the ratio is really bottomed out, and as soon as that B2 section ends, you see the ratio coming back up, and the same at B3. So there seems to be a confirmation with this technique for the same divisions that we saw in the oral formulaic language. The other thing that this technique suggests is that in Old English orthography, the eth symbol came from the Celtic tradition, whereas the foreign symbol came from the Germanic tradition. And the eth symbol entered the orthography earlier. So by that logic, sections or poems that have a higher concentration of eth, you might expect to be older. And in this case, each of the B sections where you're having a downtrending ratio is telling us there's relatively more F's than thorns, i.e. these passages might be older. So that's looking at the technique at the very high level and the very zoomed in level of orthography. But what about that middle layer? So here's where dendrogram analysis comes in. This is maybe the hardest one to explain, so I'll take a moment to try to explain it. So what's going on with dendrogram analysis is we take a poem and we cut it up into chunks, okay? And for each of those chunks, we want to generate a stylistic profile for the poet based on the frequency that he uses each word, right? If there are 5 ands in this piece and 6 ands in this piece, they have a difference of 1 and, okay? 1 occurrence of and. Now we do that with every single word, and we can calculate a distance, basically, in between 2 chunks of text based on how they're using the words that they use differently, if that makes sense, okay? So that's how we generate a profile. And what the dendrogram does is just organize that information in such a way, by comparing every piece, we can see what pieces are most similar and what pieces are least similar. And we can make a tree diagram. This is essentially the same kind of algorithms they do for genetics, right? To see how 2 pieces of genome are similar or different. And we can create this tree structure that helps us see visually how these pieces interact. And so what I did is take those A and B components, those Andreas A and Andreas B chunks, and generate a cluster analysis, a dendrogram of those pieces to see, do these pieces have a style within themselves? Do the A pieces like the A pieces and don't like the B's, and vice versa? And what we see is indeed that is the case. The Andreas A sections tend to cluster with themselves, as you can see in the graph here, and the B sections tend to cluster with themselves. Now, what's interesting, and I blew by this a little bit on the earlier charts, is that there is one section of the Andreas A, that does have a lot of Beowulf stuff. Why don't I jump back and show you really quickly. Here, this first A piece, you can see with the Beowulfian formula and the Beowulfian compounds, in that first piece has a high green. That happens to be the sea voyage, when Andreas is sailing to Myrmidon in order to save Matthew. The very piece that is the most iconically Beowulfian, there's a little bit extra of Beowulf in that A. And I can't go into much detail about that, but I do surmise in my paper that there's an extra piece of Andreas B that's just been heavily edited and kind of stuck in that bit because of that sea voyage piece. He's edited a little bit more. So when we come to the cluster analysis, we see that special sea voyage piece is also called out in its own bit, which I've just labeled Beowulf in purple on the far side. Now, one thing, this might be a little bit misleading in the sense that the way that dendrograms work, you can think of them kind of as like a mobile. If you've ever made a mobile or art class or had one for a baby, you can imagine them spinning, right? So although the B section is far to the left and the Beowulf section is far to the right in this particular dendrogram, if you spin it in your mind, it might help you realize that what this dendrogram is saying is that they're actually more similar than A. The Beowulf piece that I've marked here and the B piece are more similar to each other than they are to Andreas. The other thing that we can use cluster analysis for is, so up to this point I've just been comparing Andreas with itself. One handy thing that you can do with this technique is you can also compare it to other pieces of text. And so what I've done is I've taken the Cynewulfian corpus, so all of those signed poems by Cynewulf, as well as a few that we know or suspect are not written by Cynewulf, and I've made a large dendrogram of all of those things and how they relate. And then I've taken each one of those pieces, the Andreas A and Andreas B, and I've inserted them into that dendrogram to see how do these pieces seem to relate to Cynewulf. Are they similar or are they not similar? And what we see when we do that is that Andreas A clusters really heavily right into the heart of the most Cynewulfian of Cynewulf parts of the signed poems, right? It sits right in the middle there with most of Elena. That poem that I showed you is the longest one that Cynewulf signed, and that's in the same manuscript. It clusters right into the center there. Whereas Andreas B, the pieces that don't share the formulaic language, that look older when we look at the orthography, and that we know have high Beowulfian formulaic language, does not cluster quite as well. Now it's still sitting in there, and I'll give you a speculation of why I think that's still sitting in the Cynewulf section, but it's definitely less Cynewulfian. It's not quite in the heart of that Cynewulfian stuff. And a matter of fact, the pieces that it clusters with over there that are Cynewulfian are kind of anomalous pieces for various reasons. So conclusions, what does all of this tell us? So each piece of data that I've shown you is congruent with the fact, with the supposition that Andreas is a composite work. Right? It seems fairly evident that this A and B distinction is not anomalous, that there's something here. We're seeing it in multiple techniques. It accords with a close reading of the text as well. And given that consequence, what might we infer from the history of the poem? And I give you the following scenario: that there was a poem, something like Andreas B, let's call it Andreas B, that existed prior to Cynewulf. Okay? This poem was concerned a lot more with telling a heroic tale of the exploits and adventures of Andreas than it was in sermonizing about Christian doctrine. When you look at Andreas B by itself, it lacks certain details that we see in that Latin manuscript I mentioned way back in the beginning. Thus, it might the author of whoever wrote Andreas B may not have known that Latin text. Since otherwise, why didn't he use those features, right? Now, given that, someone, either Cynewulf or probably a follower who knew his work, one of the two, expanded that Andreas A poem with the material that expanded Andreas B with the material that I'm calling Andreas A, which adds the moralizing episodes, an imitatio Christi, where Andreas is going through 3 days of tribulation like Jesus did. Things of this sort. Adding explicit Christian doctrine in places that seem ambiguous about such things. And given that the stuff in Andreas A clearly does share features with the Latin manuscript, one possible motivation for doing such a thing might have been to harmonize a known poem with a Latin source that the poet of what we now call Andreas was familiar with. And then finally, what I hope to take, that if there's one thing for the audience to take away from this talk, I would hope it would be this last point, which is, I think, coming from a computer science background, I think quantitative approaches can really augment traditional critical techniques in the humanities. In particular, I would invite you to consider my charting, my plotting of Andy Orchard's data, and that when you do that, it shows that there's something that needs to be explained. I think the quantitative approaches and techniques offer all of us an opportunity to see things in perhaps a new way that doesn't need to be combative to the humanities, but additive. And with that, I hope I have a few moments for questions.
Any questions from the?
Yeah, Tom.
I would be interested in putting these two talks in dialogue, because how do you understand a composite work like Andreas within this vocabulary? Thoughts from either? No?
I would say that Andreas, the second author, Andreas, thank you. It looks like there's an expansion, retroactive expansion, which is not a retcon because it doesn't sound like the second author reinterpreted the material, but inserted expanded expansions that kept everything as is, instead of not retcons, but retroactive expansions.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. There's one piece that maybe would be a retcon that I didn't have a chance to talk about, which is on the sea voyage. The Latin manuscript actually has the boatman, the person who's piloting the boat, is Jesus in disguise. Now, it appears, as best as I can reconstruct it, that in Andreas B, he was just a guy.
That's a perfect retcon.
Right? It's an excellent retcon. But for the most part, you're right. It's pretty much inserted. Yeah. Anything else before we have lunch? Yeah.
Are you familiar with Q-sum charts?
No, Q-sum.
It's a cumulative sum of the deviation from the mean.
Okay.
Which might be something worthwhile. So if you go back to your, I think it's the rolling window analysis.
Yep.
One of the things that a Q-sum chart is useful is seeing when you have a very noisy signal, when something changes.
Yep.
So I'm familiar with it from an industrial engineering standpoint, where we made a change to a machine and we wanted to see if the failure rate increased or decreased. And so, what the failure rate to do with the machine failing versus what it was testing failing. And so we made a change to the machine. We still had a very noisy failure signal because we were submitting some bad stuff.
Yep.
But you can see a sort of discontinuity in this chart when something changed. So that might be something worth looking up.
Yeah, no, that sounds exciting. Definitely. Well, it definitely sounds like it has affinities with the rolling window technique.
Yeah.